Good day, friends. Welcome to another Word of Gord. Average Folks in the Afterlife number 70. And it does seem a little on the dark side, doesn't it? It's a cloudy day, what can I say? And it'll probably be sunny by this afternoon, but this afternoon will be too late for the natural interior lighting. Continuing on with our reading and discussion of Asmina Suleiman's A Passage to Eternity, her extended NDE experience. She was talking about light and prayer before, and I think we'll just continue on from there. Remarkably, I also discovered that when lights of varying degrees of brightness came together as one in prayer, as in the case of a group or congregational prayers, something quite phenomenal occurred. The lights in the hearts of those present seemed to charge up and shine brighter as they swirled around and commingled with the other lights there. And amazingly, the combined power and resonance of their lights seemed to somehow stoke and rekindle the lesser lights among them. The end result was a powerful flare of light, similar to an SOS signal that carried a greater thrust and momentum into heaven, and thus had a greater chance of being acknowledged. Again, this notion of a sentient being acknowledging prayer. I would tend to see it in terms of like attracts like, energy of similar vibrations, call and response. The obvious bombardment of light upon my person suddenly started to make perfect sense. I realized I was at the receiving end of a great deluge of prayers pouring into heaven for my recovery. Not only was I being touched to the core, but I also seemed to be responding with a few sparks of my own as this magnificent outpouring of light converged and fused into every particle of my being. It was like being struck by lightning many times over, as several megawatts of high voltage energy charged unendingly through the very essence of my soul. And you can imagine when celebrities pass, well-loved celebrities, and the kind of energy they either receive or have to be protected from, because even the average person gets quite a few prayers and thoughts of light and love sent to them. And I've been aware of this for many, many years. It was pointed out to me in an earlier book, something I read in the 70s about a book. I read it in the 70s, it was written in the 20s, about the love that celebrities were receiving when they passed. And I think it was the sudden increase in megawatt stardom brought about by the silent movies. People like Valentino, for example. And it was spoken of in a book, an occult book I read, that stars now had to be shielded and protected because they had so many people devoted to them who sent thoughts of love and prayer to them when they passed. Up until now, the dominant colours that I had perceived within myself as well as my immediate surroundings seemed to be a serene blue, interspersed with splashes of vibrant green. Yet now I saw myself being transformed into a golden white mass of living energy. I recognized this animated change of light as God's gift of life to me, one that had literally jump-started me back to life. At the same time, I became aware of a luminous object flowing towards me in the distance and suddenly being placed in my electrically charged hand. To my great surprise, it was a golden fountain pen. The pen, it was impressed upon my mind, was a symbolic reminder of the mission I was to carry back with me to Earth. Just as I was beginning to grasp the significance of the pen as an instrument of knowledge, I found myself being draped in a scintillating fusion of liquid green light. The veneer of kaleidoscopic green seemed to somehow convey to me the gift of good health that was being bestowed upon me for my physical recovery. Witnessing such sublime wonders of the spirit world made me realize that I was indeed experiencing something quite unique and magical. I now knew that as a matter of the deepest conviction in my heart, as well as direct personal experience, that there truly existed a higher realm of reality, one that was not dependent on desire or thought for its existence. Good point. Yet it was something of the vast majority of us were not even aware. I'm about to sneeze now, hang on. Just as there are degrees of higher learning in our academic world, I discovered that there is a hierarchy in the spirit world that builds upon itself. Like overlapping concentric circles, each dimension both connects as well as separates one dimension from the other. And at death, we tend to naturally gravitate toward that dimension or plane of existence which is most attuned to our dominant consciousness. Yes. This includes our primary beliefs, attitudes, and value systems that have not only helped shape our thinking, but have ultimately governed our actions during that particular lifetime on Earth. Thus, it occurred to me that in order to gain access into a dimension higher than the one we are currently on, we have to dramatically shift our consciousness, our primary beliefs, and attitudes. But it is not a matter of making a lateral shift in our thinking, namely the accumulating more of the same type of thoughts, but rather a paradigm shift in our consciousness. This means acquiring an altogether different type of thinking that may even require a certain leap of faith into the unknown on our part. Well, yes, paradigm shift, indeed. At the very least, I recognized that we needed to at least be open to the possibility that higher reality could well exist by cultivating an openness in our thinking while we are still physically alive. For at death, our consciousness automatically zeroes in onto the dimension that meshes in with our current thinking. The fifth dimension, therefore, is a place that is strictly reserved for those of a more esoteric turn of mind. Well, that's me. It draws seekers of truth who have actively sought out the truth and attempted to delve into the hidden and deeper dimensions of life during their lifetimes on Earth. Thus, access to the fifth dimension requires a deeper kind of faith. I would say a deeper type of knowledge. The type that transcends the apparent and looks beyond the superficial differences of race, color, class, creed, sex, religion, and recognizes the underlying humanity of all people. Indeed, I realized that it was no small coincidence that I had encountered a particular breed of individuals, such as Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and others like them on the fifth dimension. These were clearly individuals on a mission who, in their special way, had actively fought against ingrained social prejudices and injustices. Above all, there were people who had stood for truth and justice for all. In retrospect, it struck me that each of the individuals in that particular group seemed to have one thing in common. They were all living examples of persons who advocated the principle of unity and diversity. Rather than look to differences that separate, they had looked to ties that bind. They recognized the innate equality of all people before God and tried to cultivate a sense of unity consciousness amongst all men. What locks us into the lower fourth dimension, the dimension that lies immediately adjacent to our physical three-dimensional world of matter, I realized, is the nature of our thoughts, particularly our notions of separateness. Only when we are able to see clear through our illusions of separation and come together as one in the common spirit of brotherhood can we hope to move forward and reach that ultimate place of oneness. Looked at in another way, separateness is diametrically opposed to the intrinsic unity of oneness. Unless we are able to demonstrably shift our thinking out of its present mode of separation and come together as one common body of humanity and life, we cannot hope to experience that oneness of spirit in death. Despite the thrill of being able to see from a purely fifth-dimensional perspective, I still felt a little disappointed. In my heart of hearts, I had somehow expected more. In spite of being exposed to the fascinating worlds of fourth and fifth dimensions, I was beginning to feel restless and somewhat trapped. I yearned to make contact with something more real and reassuring, like my Lord. Not as a hidden or invisible presence, but as someone whom I could see in living color. Even before I finished formulating the very thought in my mind, I heard a deep rumble of laughter in the distance, prompting me to look toward that far horizon. What I witnessed next completely blew me away. In that wild and earth-shattering moment of cognizance, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that there was more to heaven than I could possibly imagine. Immediately ahead, I could see a broad beam of light descend slowly downwards and fuse itself with the upper stratosphere of the space directly above me. Then, from within that solitary ray of brilliance, I saw several of God's messengers manifest themselves and stand before me in all their shining glory. As I watched in stunned silence, I realized that I was once again witnessing a powered-down version of these illuminated beings of light. Yet this august body of individuals before me seemed somehow more radiant, more vibrant, and more translucent than the individuals in my previous group. At the same time, they appeared less dense and much less defined. Although I saw these individuals whose peculiar countenance seemed familiar to me, I could not make out the actual colouring of their eyes, their complexion, or their hair. Instead, I saw in their pure perspective of light and shade, where the very notion of colour seemed superficial. The only thing that vaguely resembled colour was a faint bluish-grey tint that lent a distinctly ethereal quality to their diaphanous forms. It alluded to the fact that they were belonging to a totally different dimension, where colour and form no longer appeared to be of the essence. The individuals within this present group seemed totally immersed and enshrouded in light. They seemed to be projecting themselves out of a single ray of light, as opposed to a series of separate and distinct lights, suggesting a lesser degree of separation from that one light source, God. Even though I could feel the glowing presence of several radiant beings of light within the light, I seemed to be able to identify only 7. Trailing all the way back to the back was the lone and bearded figure of the prophet Noah. The rest seemed to follow in pairs. The first pair seemed to emerge in my direct line of vision. That was the duskier form of the prophet Moses, beside the slightly more diminutive frame of Jesus Christ. They were immediately followed by a cross-legged Buddha seated next to a flute-playing Lord Krishna. Now these, of course, are cliched images drawn from religious traditions and writings. And that doesn't make them any the less real, but it does include them in the notion of mental projections going from the experiencer outward. What struck me as a little odd at this point was the fact that I could also see a hazy blue-toned vision of another four-armed Indian deity projecting itself from the slender and effeminate frame of Lord Krishna. Their faces seemed to get a little out of focus even as they blurred into each other. It was like seeing double, except that each double seemed to have a distinctly different face. I had no idea as to the identity of the four-armed deity at the time. It was only months later that I discovered it was Lord Vishnu, the East Indian deity believed to be an avatar or former reincarnation of Lord Krishna himself. At the end of the long procession of individuals was the broad and stalwart figure of Prophet Muhammad. Even though I've yet to see a picture or reasonable facsimile of that prophet, I seem to be intuitively able to recognize him. He has a mass of thick dark hair and an intensely penetrating quality to his eyes, something that was, in fact, confirmed by his cousin and son-in-law Hazrat Ali in a documented description of the Prophet. What surprised me, however, was the fact that standing next to the Prophet Muhammad was the shining countenance of the Virgin Mary, or Bibi Miriam, as she is commonly referred to in Islam. Well, that's the first I'd heard that. Looking at it logically, I would have expected to see the figure of Mother Mary beside her son Jesus of Nazareth. But as I discovered many months later, the Virgin Mary is venerated in her own right by Muslims the world over. In fact, she merits a special place in the Quran, the holy book of Muslims, universally acclaimed by Muslims to be the Word of God, transmitted through the Prophet Muhammad. Well, I think we can see the effect of religious belief and how it influences the perceptions of a believer once freed from the body. And I would say, without any shadow of a doubt, much the same is true for all religious believers. They project what they expect to see subconsciously, and as do agnostics and atheists. Although what atheists expect to see is nothing, but they project a nothingness, a darkness and nothingness, of course not realizing that they're projecting it. They think it's reality. And that's the great thing about, or the maddening thing, if you like, about belief systems and assumptions, unconscious assumptions. People that hold them, and almost everybody does, think that their assumptions and expectations and projections are in fact a ground reality from which everyone else's belief system is a kind of outlaw variation. I don't know about you, but I'm always amused by that. As I reflected in awe upon this rare and majestic vision of the illuminated messengers of God, I felt my spirit soar. Projecting itself out from the dazzling form of the Prophet Muhammad, the last in God's great line of prophets, was the luminous face of my beloved Lord, Ali. I felt myself irresistibly drawn toward their combined radiance. As I drew closer, their faces seemed to blur and become obliterated by the sheer power and brilliance of their light. All I could see was the glowing incandescence of their shining frames as they once again merged and coalesced into a single ray of light. In that brief but glorious moment of illumination, I knew that I had arrived. I had arrived at the threshold of my truth. And, I'm glad she said that. I arrived at the threshold of my truth. So more sort of religious projections in the next little section. And I'll move along to something of a different hue. She has time to ponder on some earlier events now. The purpose of a life review, I realized, was to help me assess the effect of my actions upon others as well as myself during a given lifetime. An emotional clearing, on the other hand, forced me to flush out and bring to the forefront of my consciousness all emotions, irrespective of lifetime, that were causing me to act or behave in a certain way. Both formats, therefore, were essentially different sides of the same coin, designed to work hand in hand to help me understand the vital cause and effect relationship running through my life. It soon became apparent to me that I could no longer turn a blind eye to my emotions or sweep them under the carpet as I had done in the past. In order for me to be able to connect with the real me inside, I knew that I had first to get in touch with my true feelings and actually allow myself to feel those feelings. That meant I would have to consciously and deliberately revisit the seething cauldron of my emotions. Emotions that had not only landed me in hot water, but were clouding my judgment and subconsciously blocking off my access to truth. Well, that's quite the statement, blocking off my access to truth. Therefore, the whole point of this emotional clearing, I realized, was to ultimately help me grow in my awareness of truth in a conscious sort of way, as opposed to unconsciously and with my eyes half closed. To my amazement, one of the first shocking truths I discovered as I ascended up the ladder of my consciousness was that I no longer even looked like myself. Gone was the familiar holographic image or astral projection of my physical self that I had grown somewhat attached to and was accustomed to seeing in the mirror. Instead, I saw myself as a misty, larger than life ovoid shape that resembled a slightly misshapen octopus minus its tentacles, and one that seemed to change color with alarming speed. As I surveyed myself in disbelief, it registered upon my mind somewhere that I was in a place where the notion of defined form was virtually non-existent. And it suddenly struck me that this somewhat unwieldy looking mass was none other than a visual representation of my ego or emotional self, and the veritable beast of my emotions. Well, I don't know. Beast? That's a little harsh. Your astral body or your emotional self is the vehicle through which you access and experience the many forms and energies of the emotional landscape that we travel through. It's an educative tool. It's not a beast. Even if it acts beastly, it's still not a beast. Yet it did not look like a two-horned devil or some fire-breathing monster, but just an unimpressive-looking blob that looked rather sad and forlorn, almost like a lost and bewildered child driven hither and thither by impulses it could not control. Even though I displayed no human features to speak of, I could feel myself glisten and reflect back subtle hints of color. I saw myself in several shades of pale blue mixed in with a little gray that seemed to give way to delicate hints of purple and rose-colored amethyst around the edges. By way of comparison, I was also shown what appeared to be earlier, less refined versions of myself. One such version revealed a bright orange streak across the top, while another seemed to cast in a deeper shade of gray with tiny flecks of fiery red speckled all over its surface. It struck me that this chameleon-like change in my colors was a reflection of the range and intensity of my emotions over the past several lifetimes on Earth. Each color and variation thereof seemed to convey a different emotion, where the deeper the tone, the more intense and ingrained was the emotion. And it occurred to me that this thing masquerading as myself was, in fact, quite literally showing off my true colors. I could see at a glance how I was projecting myself to the world emotionally, and it became apparent to me that there was absolutely no hiding from the truth, or making one's true feelings in this place. Masking one's true feelings. The deeper oranges and reds in the earlier version of myself, I realized, had hinted at past egotistical tendencies in my emotional makeup, as well as a smoldering anger that I had often kept suppressed. The darker shades evidently represented my less desirable emotions, ones that I had to struggle with the most and had to overcome in the course of my many lifetimes. Happily, from what I could see of myself now, I appeared to be much lighter and clearer, as well as more even toned in the canvas of my emotions. I thus saw that I was not merely exhibiting emotional tendencies from a single lifetime, but emotions that had spanned several lifetimes. It soon became clear to me that my emotional die had been cast long before I was even born into my present life. And it struck me, quite apart from being a physical and spiritual being, I was also an emotional being. And that exhibiting emotion was an essential part of the dynamics of being human. Yes, indeed, it is. As I reflected upon myself farther, it occurred to me that this thing that was strutting its stuff before me and seemingly calling the shots was, in actual fact, just an overblown bag of mixed emotions. Yet this puffed up mass of emotions, with its prismatic array of colors, seemed to have the very real ability to color my perceptions of reality. I therefore realized that this ovoid mess was not just a visual barometer of my feelings, but it was also a powerful indicator of how far I had allowed my own emotions to blind me to the truth. I now saw what Plato, that ancient Greek philosopher and moralist, had seen all along. I was suddenly able to grasp the true essence of the wisdom embedded in one of his more notable sayings, namely, self-conquest is the greatest of all victories. I now knew exactly what it was that he was referring to. He was referring to the conquest of my emotional self, this inner demon of my emotions. There we go, negative again. With my own personalized Satan or emotional devil that lived within me as opposed to outside. I saw how this insidious creature of my emotions that had reared up its ugly head from time to time and blindsided me with its seductive whispers of non-reason was the true enemy in my life. Of course, I don't particularly agree with that, but that's Asmina's reality and her interpretation of it. Emotions are not the enemy. Even negative emotions are not the enemy. They're yet another expression. And, if you weren't making up a whole pile of lousy karma as a young soul, what would you have to do as an old soul? I mean, most of us are making up for lost time and stupid stuff we did hundreds of years ago. And as an old soul, that gives us something to do. Thus, in order to win that greater war in the salvation of our souls, I realized that we needed to do constant battle with ourselves, not some imaginary devil living outside of us. Oh, good. Not some imaginary devil. It was something that we needed to combat on a daily basis, namely by actively resisting the primary emotions and animal-like instincts of our lower selves, such as pride, anger, avarice, envy, lust, hatred, and selfishness. It occurred to me that these were, in fact, the very same emotions that caused us to disconnect ourselves from the light of truth within. Therefore, more than anything else, this was an ongoing inner struggle in our lives to gain mastery over our lower emotions and conquer this dark side of ourselves that constituted the true jihad, or holy war in our lives. Oh, that's a hot term. Let's not use that too much. This meant religiously examining our inner motives and actions in honesty and recognizing our emotional weaknesses that made us prey to that devil within. Hence, the holiest war that we could wage was the one where we took up arms against ourselves, where we reprimanded ourselves for our moral indiscretions every time we failed to act according to reason or some higher ideal. Well, failing to act with reason is not always an exemplary path. Sometimes reason commits appalling crimes. And we can get into that another time. I now was truly able to grasp how the whole purpose of life on earth hinged around improving ourselves. Well, there's that. I would say experiencing ourselves, not improving ourselves. And I saw how that key to self improvement ultimately lay in mastering our egos and subduing this shadowy side of ourselves. It also became patently clear to me that the amount of struggle or effort that we put into exercising our emotional demons directly determined our rate of progress on that often steep and slippery slope of evolution. A lot more stuff about the emotions, of course. Um, Therefore, it became clear to me that one of our main tasks as human beings was to redirect and transform the raw force of our passions and emotions into a more constructive force in our lives. The goal was to make it work for us rather than against us. This required a balanced or controlled approach to life by injecting that right mix of spontaneous emotion and disciplined restraint into our workaday lives. It meant knowing exactly when to slam on the brakes and when to accelerate down the speedway. And it meant keeping a right tight leash on this passionate and impulsive part of us by exercising just the right amount of caution and intellectual restraint over this volatile and reactive aspect of ourselves. Yeah, I like the leash metaphor. Long leash. God's greatest gift to mankind, I realized, is his intellect. One that essentially distinguishes his finest creation, man, from the beast. So again, I don't really agree with that. And it is our very ability to think, reason, and ultimately differentiate between right and wrong that enables us to keep this unruly side of ourselves in check. Thus, it is primarily our use of the intellect that we are able to restrain ourselves and ultimately find that higher ground in our lives. A little bit more on religion here. While all organized religions try to provide an outer framework for worship, the true essence or inner core of all religions essentially revolves around the same thing, namely the call to live more model lives. Thus, every time we make a genuine effort to live by the truth and lead model and ethical lives, we are, in essence, improving upon our character and that inner condition of our spirits. And every time we try to improve upon the inner conditions of our spirits, we are, in fact, practicing spirituality, which really is the true intent and purpose of all religions, regardless of their founder. As Socrates himself once pointed out, what was important was not living, but living rightfully. Rightfully. Tisk tisk. Sloppy, sloppy. Therefore, until such time as we are able to have an open dialogue with our own inner voice of conscience, the one that prompts us to live morally upright and ethical lives, we need to look outside ourselves. We need to look to the religious commandments as well as the moral teachings and intellectual wisdom of those more enlightened amongst us. Well, yes, prophets are lighthouses of moral guidance and ethical purity. And they certainly do more good than harm, no question about that. But at the same time, let us not forget the amount of horrific, violent, repressive action has been taken under the auspices of religious prophets as interpreted by politicians and kings and warlords. They use their holy books and their holy laws as justification for repression. They always have, and they probably will continue to do so. At least some of them will. So, you know, more more thoughts on morality, and the less, for me, the less the better. I think it's more important to embrace all our past lives and see how we played many parts in the great unfolding theatre of evolution. And Asmina, we'll get to that in the next section, I see. But for now, we'll pause, or I will pause, and you will pause with me, I hope, and consider such ruminations as part of our day. And until next time, which will probably be fairly soon, I bid you a fond farewell.